Next, I'd like to ask Brendan, Wendy, Georgios and Stephen if they could come up to the front, because we've have an open question and answer session. So if you please make your way up. And while we're doing that, please, if there's some questions coming forward, I've already had a number of people either send me questions or raise questions during the break. I just want to, are we okay with our video? They'll be able to see the people, because you don't want to see me during this. I'm not going to help too much. Just while we're doing that, the biggest exhibition of heating, ventilation, refrigeration and air conditioning products and services takes place in August in Melbourne on the 16th and 17th. It's called ARBS. And so there will be some case studies presented from iHub at this at ARBS, but also for those who are not aware of ARBS, it is worthwhile to be able to go along and see what is actually happening in the industry itself. And this, again, a whole variety of products and services in there. It's normally run every 2 years. It hasn't run since, I think, May 2018 because of COVID. So essentially that is worthwhile to go along. All right, folks, thank you very much for coming up and being open to the questions. First thing I would like to ask each of you is, what is next? We've done all this, you've done all your work, you know, so what is next with this work? What are you going to do with it? And we just go down in order, if that's all right, or whoever's brave to go next. But that's all right. Brendan, you've got it.
I think we've learned a lot. We've got a stack of material there. So next in terms of the IDSs is really just trying to convert that to traction and impact out in industry, which I think is harder, easier said than done, I should say, because it's about psychology. So, and I think that's been a bit of a common theme I've heard today anyways. We have all of the bits together, and the hard bit's actually getting them all together and actually making them work with people and the prospect of facilities out in the marketplace.
Thank you, Brendan.
From the data clearinghouse perspective, I guess we've got a bunch of commercial legacy sort of opportunities that we're chasing, as well as some sort of public good type activities. On the commercial front, we have the data clearinghouse. It's an IoT platform, and so we welcome the opportunity to work with companies that are interested in extracting data out of their equipment and what have you. I sort of see these as kind of thin data streams that, back to base kind of functionality. It's a data collection tool like many others on the market, and that's one route where we would commercialise the technology. The other side then is actually sort of creating this ecosystem in the market, where the data clearinghouse is a not-for-profit type organisation is created, and it manages this infrastructure on behalf of the industry for the industry. And that's been kind of a long-term goal, and so we'll be continuing to work on that. And so, at least for the moment, inside CSIRO, we have what we call as a model, sort of proto-business, if you like, and that's to try and get over that sort of hockey stick sort of thing, where particularly with platforms, you kind of need people who are users of the platform and people who are providers on the platform, and so it's very much a bootstrapping exercise. So certainly for the foreseeable future, CSIRO will continue to look after that platform on behalf of the industry. And then the sort of third way in which we'd sort of continue to use the learnings of what we've got is sort of looking at standards and guidelines and things like that. And, can we help the industry to advise on this sort of, and particularly in my mind, this concept of digital ready that I talked about in the presentation there. Talked with the Big Data Special Technical Group and a little bit of work to do there, but I think we sort of think that this is a good thing to work on to help people to sort of understand how to go those first steps of getting their buildings to the plate where they can actually start to take advantage of digital services.
Thank you, Stephen. Wendy?
From the Living Labs, with the healthcare, we started with relationships with 3 healthcare providers, a hospital and 2 aged care centres. We now have a knowledge sharing group that's got over 40 members. That includes every state government health department and several private hospital providers and a range of aged care providers. And each of those organisations has a net zero energy target in their policy, but they don't know how to do it. So the next stage for us is helping them get there, and part of that is the roadmap that we'll present as well as all the findings from the DCH. So I'd like to see that we can continue that process of engaging that group of people who want to know how are they going to deliver their policy targets of getting to net zero energy.
Yeah, again, the Living Labs, I'll just continue for the Living Labs here. There are a series of other projects that we didn't present, we didn't include in our presentations here today from the school sector. And there is one of these projects is the so-called sector-wide project, and that involves, again, stakeholders coming together from different states talking about infrastructure, school infrastructure. And we are part of that, but a component of that project was really bringing together the data that they are available from the different states and putting them together in a format that is, we can benchmark school buildings. And now we are talking with a neighbors team to include that data set in the neighbors school tool. So I think there is a utilization that there is discussion there that how to utilize our data within the new tool for schools. So that's one thing that is happening. In fact, tomorrow we are talking to them again on how to share data with no really, it's just sharing of data and improving the tools for schools. Then with ACT Schools, which is one of our other Living Labs partner, we will be signing a commercial contract with them to continue the Living Labs for several seasons because they want to see longer evaluations, really, not just within the timeline of iHub, and where we are going to be testing prototypes from, I'll mention company names here. Silly International is providing a prototype there to test in one of the school buildings, and we're going to evaluate a replacement of a gas boiler system with electric CO2 heat pump, as well as a longer evaluation of a heat recovery ventilation system for a transportable classroom, for which we were told that, tell us if it works, and if that works, we're going to deploy this in, all of our classrooms. Because of COVID now, they want these systems, the heat recovery ventilation systems are very popular. Just to add one more thing, for the aged care, the Wargal project that Dan and Michael were presenting earlier, our university provided us with a small funding to run a few workshops with the industry partners and the aged care Living Lab host to start talking about the kind of things that Dan and Michael were talking about earlier, because currently there is a huge gap, as Michael was saying, between this kind of players.
Thanks for that.
Tanya, just wanted to add to what Wendy was saying. Those net zero targets are really important. I didn't pay them as much heed as I should have, but we work with 3 government or council organisations. The aquatic centres, the schools, and Ambulance Victoria, and all of those organisations are just scratching their heads about how they're going to meet these high-level, 2045 net zero targets. And Ambulance Victoria went from employing someone who was asking a question. They came to iHub because they didn't know. They've been through the IDSs, and they're now going to they've got their first prototype net zero ambulance station planned for Mallacoota. And that's a pretty quick turnaround. literally probably 12 months that happened over. So it's, I hate to say this, but government targets like that, high-level spruiking targets are really important.
No, excellent, thanks for that. I'm going to ask one more question of each, and if there's some from the floor, we'll then turn to that. Stephen, I'll pick up with you. You mentioned about standards and guidelines. What's possible? What's possible out of this?
So I guess in the data space, there are a number of sort of technical standards or guidelines or protocols there. Clearly, when it comes to interoperability between devices and stuff, we've got BACnet, continue that journey of adoption of those kinds of standards. Then when it comes to fault detection and diagnosis, we have point tagging conventions like Haystack and things like that. So again, we need to sort of push those sorts of standards. And then we actually start to go out into full-scale sort of smart buildings and occupant-centric services and things like that. We need to sort of almost federate ourselves and with the web, and then you're starting to look at more those sort of relational standards and the metadata, and this is where the brick schema sort of starts to come in. So, we've helped to develop some of the work inside the brick schema, and we'd sort of continue to work on that, and really trying to push technically towards that idea of plug-and-play, self-service type digital applications. So that's on the technical front, and then it's technical, but it's also got a commercial thing. Is sort of, can we get in sort of guidelines around what we deem to be sort of a threshold level of digital ready that gives people like retailers, electricity retailers, confidence that they can go into a building and they can get a sticker number, a plug-and-play number of flexible demand from that building. And what's the requirements to be able to demonstrate that and give certainty to retailers so that they can recruit buildings into these flexible demand markets?
Thank you for that, Stephen. Brendan, I'll ask you one. The IDSs had a lot to do with education, I felt. I think there are skill gaps in the industry. What do you see them? You could disagree with me. And if you do agree with me, what are they and what can be done? Is it more education? That's what I'm really saying.
Well, you're talking to a professor, so the answer is always more education. Look, I think the gaps are out there, but like I said, I don't think we're short on technical knowledge. I think we're short on how to bring that technical knowledge together and actually implement it out in practice. So, we're seeing, one of the things we saw around the IDSs was this groundswell of architects and engineers talking together more. And we've seen it in, all of the 3 institutions that were involved, and in other institutions in Victoria and Melbourne in particular. So the symposium, Monash University, we're very keen to be involved and presented at that symposium, as did Swinburne. So the number of architectural engineering courses starting up is really growing. And that's what we need. We need to bring the humanities and STEM stuff together to solve these problems together, because it's the only way it will actually happen at the end of the day. We can't do it alone. So that's where the gaps are. We need engineers doing micro-credentials in architecture and vice versa with architecture, architects doing courses in engineering and understanding.
Actually, onto that, is that about registration? Like if you want to keep your registration, you've got to do CPD in certain areas, because one thing about this whole industry all the industry that I know about, it's a bit of carrot and stick, that if we didn't actually have, net zero by 2050, I don't think we'd be naturally doing that, and so do we need government or do we need industry bodies like ERA to start to mandate some of this if you want to be a registered engineer or an ARPN, which we talk about up here?
It's a very good question. I'm sort of turning it over in my mind. I mean, one of the things about the University of Melbourne architectural engineering course is quite different, because it's almost a full double degree. You can practice as an architect or you can practice as an engineer when you graduate. but you're never going to do both because education is so many years at university, so many years in industry, and then you get accredited. So to sign off on both, you'd be essentially doing a 6-year master's course and then minimum 3 years in engineering, minimum 3-4 years in architecture. It's just never going to happen, and no company really wants you to sign off on both either. So I'm more of a fan of you need engineers who are very, very good engineers but understand the architectural side of things, and vice versa, the other way around. So I think that it should be a part of how CPD gets assessed, because you need to understand your discipline, but your discipline alone is no good in this world. You need to understand how your discipline plugs into everything around society. So I'd like to see a 20-30% requirement on understanding the disciplines around you.
Thanks for that. And Wendy and Georgios, please join in. This really gets around to, we've done a lot with the living labs, right? What is there a methodology we can put around this now? So how do we make this more like a cookie cutter approach, if you like to say? Is there documents we've got to put in place before projects are started?
We certainly developed a renewable energy, what was the REIT and enabling technologies and services framework. But I think ultimately there are issues regarding setting up specific buildings to be living labs because of whether the hosts of living labs can enable physical technologies to be plugged in and plugged out to be tested and things like that. So I think ultimately I would like to see every building as a living lab, or see itself as a living lab, so that and that they all follow or adapt some of the frameworks that we suggested, that you need a certain amount of instrumentation, which would be good from the point of view of being able to validate the performance of technologies, but will also then feed into DCH and demand response capabilities. And then try to get industry and building owners to freely share what technologies are working or not working in their buildings. I mean, a lot of buildings do, or some owners are trying new things, but when they fail, they're not sharing that with other people, so that we get lots of failures or no sharing about what works and what doesn't work. So we need a lot more. If every building was a living lab and you were sharing all of the ups and the downs, we would learn much quicker, I think.
Yeah, I don't see a very, very standardized kind of method to achieve this, but in general, because every building is different, but in general you are looking into instrumenting buildings to expect to answer questions around the energy performance and the indoor conditions, so sub-metering, I guess, and temperature, CO2, if you have the budget for that, temperature, CO2, and some sort of, I'm not sure if you can really include window openings and closings, and yeah, all of this has to be, I guess, transmitted over the internet ideally, so that you have people to collaborate, DCH and other kind of providers to use the data and evaluate whatever you're implementing.
I'd probably add to that something that I think all buildings should do is look at a much broader range of energy use indicators, or KPIs. Just using kilowatt hours per square metre is a dumb measure. Yeah. We need a lot more peak demand, and not just annual figures, but also seasonal, monthly, daily figures, but also things like renewable energy capacity, resilience, thermal autonomy. So when the power goes off, how long can your building support human life safely? If you don't have a generator and the power's off, for, a whole range of different KPIs, and that's one of the really good things that I see have come out of the living labs and the other work, is that there's a lot more that we could measure and report on that gives us a lot more information about how our buildings actually perform. And it's not also just energy, it's also the occupant, so how it relates to health and comfort of the occupants.
No, thanks. I've just spent some time at our refrigeration conference, and no matter what, those things phase down. The government just gave a presentation this morning. This is all coming. It's a reality. It's just a matter of time. So all these things are going to help. I don't want to monopolise the questions, but are there any questions from the floor at this stage? I do have a couple more that people, please, that have sent me.
What's next?
For me or for them?
No, just for everyone. What's next in all of the different team leaders here?
Well,
is that personally or around IHAP? Yeah. Yep.
Well, we've got, I guess, there's a whole lot of things that are coming next. The biggest one for me is probably industry engagement. So I want to try and harness a lot of the positivity that's out there and passion that's out there around net zero and sustainability, and actually try and, like I said, get some traction on that in industry. And there's people starting to do that. So we're getting invited to different conferences and seminars, and in fact invited to smaller meetings with sustainability consultants who are interested in regenerative design and all of that sort of thing. So yeah, people want to know about it. So there's a very receptive audience out there. We just need to actually get into some of the bigger consultants and client groups as well. Like I said earlier, the clients are such an important part of that power triangle between engineering, architecture and money. Yeah, we need to get into those client conferences and talk about, you know, we can design our buildings differently and it will be a better product and you'll save money and resources on the way through. And all of these projects that we've done, you know, it's towards net zero, but there's better air, indoor air quality, all of that sort of thing. It's a much better design overall. It's not just the engineering.
So in regard to the data clearinghouse, I mentioned a bunch of sort of ways in which we will be looking to utilise that going forward, and also the design and standards and guidelines and stuff that we'd be working on. So, you know, in terms of content, that's a bit of the what next. But I think perhaps what you allude to there is we've got a hell of a lot of infrastructure, capacity building, people on the job, kit installed in what are living lab sites, not just the living lab sites, but the data clearinghouse sites, etc., and how important that is in terms to keep on leveraging that with testing new opportunities, new services, new products, and things like that. So I'd certainly love to keep working with those host sites.
Two things that come to mind from our perspective. One is to keep the involvement of the state government health departments with a view to changing the hospital design guidelines, to consider, to make sure that future climates are part of the modelling, to understand then what the future HVAC loads will be and then what technologies need to be. But then also applying some of the demand response things in a residential setting. So a new living lab will be starting in Queensland shortly as part of the Race for 2030 CRC, which in essence all of the houses will replicate a fair bit what the 2022 new National Construction Code will be. So 7+ star buildings, PVs, battery storage, EV charging, API-controlled HVAC, and the smart controls to manage demand response with the network provider, and seeing what that means at a household level and a community level, because they're all on the one server, on the one part of the network.
Yeah, and I mean, we covered a lot of that earlier on when we talked about, you know, the neighbours team is taking advantage of or utilizes the data that we collected. ACT schools are, in our case, willing to continue. It's only really a bit less than $2,000 on telemetry fees. The sensors are there now, the infrastructure is there per year, I think, or about $1,000, $2,000 telemetry fish, and that's it. Really, you don't need anything more other than that, and people, of course, to use the data and understand them. Other than that, also I hear that our university wants to replicate the living lab model really in some of the our campuses. So it seems that it makes sense, you know, when you have too many buildings, to be able to know where is your weakness and how to improve that weakness.
So just one other thing I'll add is on the integrated design studios, all three universities are going to continue that program in an unfunded form. So you know, you see the value in it, and I wouldn't lay claim to having initiated the direction to bringing architecture and engineering together. iHub and IDSs has definitely helped it, but it is, you can see the mindset change happening in the design industry, and that's what we need to do. So that's been really encouraging, because it's just going to keep on growing.
No, thanks for that. Also, there's been ongoing conversations, George, as you mentioned, with Race 2030, also the Building 4.0 CRC. So there are other conversations we're having where ERA, and I know these people have, because I keep on asking them to do it, but to talk to those people, but that are going on. I do have a couple more questions. One of them's for you, Stephen. We talked about flexible demand a lot. We talked about, that came up, it was been through the project. What can governments do to basically help support that concept of flexible demand?
I wouldn't want to put anything in the mouth of government here, but we have been doing a lot of research, and what people have been telling me that they would like government to do. Market design, we ran a project on flexible demand with the Race for 2030 CRC, and you know, identified that flexible demand as a product is essentially a capacity product. I think that came up a few times. And how does that play into the current electricity market structures of wholesale demand, wholesale market, RERT, FCAS and the like, and it kind of doesn't play in all that well, and so there is a kind of a market reform piece there that I know industry is asking for. In a lot of our focus group research there, a lot more of the trial by doing, you know, this is what we're doing in iHub, but really industry is looking for getting more certainty by demonstrating in more building typologies, more climate zones, more approaches and stuff. So very much a trial by doing is something that the government could support. And the other one was, you know, coming through from the retailers, and again, it's sort of brought up before, this sort of idea of certainty and you know, looking for some kind of register of certified digital ready buildings that are available and have got their capacity demonstrated for flexible demand, so that it is easy to call on it and to offer products and services. So I don't know if that is some sort of certified database kind of thing, maybe something that's sort of a non-competitive thing the government could support with. They're just some things that have come through from the discussions that I've been having with industry partners.
Thanks for that. Any other questions you have to ask that? Nathan? Well, I think you might need a mic to be picked up on the video, please.
You talked about the engagement in the integrated design studios where architects and engineers come together, and the client. And my experience as a consultant is that ambitious projects with a really engaged client often have that success. But so many projects fall down when you then get into the contracting space and how the project is procured. And you've talked about the complexity of the demand response market. But in the IDS process, did you engage with builders in different types of contracting methodologies, such as design and construct, or full documentation, partial documentation, and how that might impact on the success of an IDS?
We didn't in Melbourne. I'll pass to Wendy in a second, who did, but I think that contractors are an incredibly important part of the equation, and it speaks to the procurement methods. And we mentioned earlier, traditional procurement methods aren't really up to scratch in terms of getting that spectrum between construction and final product compressed back into the design so that it's all happening together and you're getting win-win-wins across the board. Wendy?
So because our IDSs included construction management and cost estimation students as well as the engineers and architects, we actually did an analysis of the traditional procurement methods, including early contractor involvement, etc. And really none of the common procurement processes are adequate for a good integrated design practice. But IDP, or IPD, Integrated Project Delivery Method, and that's things like alliance contracting. And there are I looked at a number of sample contracts that a group called NEC in the UK actually have that you can get online now. That so in essence, all of the participants in the design process, so your engineers, architects, construction managers, etc., have a risk sharing agreement. They have a profit sharing agreement that's based on achieving the performance outcomes. So there are sample templates of such agreements available now that sort of have emerged in the last 2 or 3 years in particular. So we need to have a different method if you are truly going to get engineers and the construction managers right at the very beginning of a process. And also in that is we noticed that the client brief differed depending on who the client was presenting the brief to. So what they present to architects and engineers and construction managers are different because in essence the brief grows as it gets passed down the chain. So in some ways you want a client who doesn't have a specific brief and you get your team together right at the beginning so that because the client's brief is often confined by what they know and what they think they want, but it might not be right anyway. So in some ways you want the IDS sort of process before a brief is formed in a client's mind, and all you really want from the client is where is the site, what's the general concept of the site, but what's my risk appetite, what technology readiness level are you prepared to have, and some sort of financial whole of life total cost of ownership sort of ideal, and are you going to own and operate the building or pass it on?
And I will say, Nathan, and I can say this because I was a consultant, I don't think that we ride consultants hard enough in our projects. I think that the status quo encourages consultants just to do what you've always done before because that's the low risk, and I know I'm going to make a certain amount, and I've got all the people there that can do that sort of thing. Whereas if you take it to an alliancing model and you change the risk reward, and you know that you can actually be rewarded for a greater output, so you get a win out of what you're making out of the project, and the client gets a win out of what they're getting off the project. There's a lot of scope for improvement there, I think, and that's where these integrated project delivery type models are really important.
Part of what I think I've been inspired in the past by Rocky Mountain Institute and their Factor 10 engineering design principles that they produced just over a decade ago, which said that if you follow a set number of principles, you can actually achieve at least a 10 times reduction in energy use. If you apply that to the IDS process, you can get your net zero energy as well. So that's sort of part of the outcomes of just rethinking everything and what's your starting point. And it's not linear.
Actually, that reminds me that AIR has been part of the Global Cooling Prize and promoting that through the Rocky Mountain Institute. And there was 3 groups awarded money, and their first report's coming out in the next couple of weeks about how they progressed essentially to produce an air conditioner that's effectively twice the current price. I think the average price is about $200 US, what they're aiming at, but basically to be about 5 or 6 times efficient. So the running cost would be basically covered in the first 2 years. So the purchasing and running cost in that. Also, I did have a comment on the Twitter sphere that came through on my phone. We were talking about how we get change. We said education. The comment was very much about, it's about a cultural change. Education is only part of it. It's a culture and way you do things. I thought that was an insightful comment on it. I have 2 more questions I want to ask. Are there any others before I try to pull that together? But please.
Thanks, Marie. Wendy, you mentioned the idea of having making every building a living lab, and Stephen, you mentioned the idea of getting that data into a data clearing house, which is wonderful. I just wondered about the idea of is there a living lab light sort of thing where you get the data and it's used for the big data sort of thing, but where there's a living lab pro like we've done that can be rolled out across more sectors to give more opportunity to still dive deep, because I see, although we've, Dan and I presented that there's complexities, there's risks in this demand response sort of stuff. There's an exciting amount of potential and momentum there, and it's not something like Brendan, you said that that the IDSs can be self-funding within the uni framework. These Living Lab Pro sort of scenarios, they're not going to be self-funding, they'll fall over. Just so how do you see that potentially continuing?
One of the patterns that I have when I'm presenting is that as an industry we are proud that our buildings are all prototypes. And I poo-poo that as being, that also means they're expensive relative to something that is cookie cutter in some form or other. And so, when we talk about a living lab, in my mind perhaps it's not so much a living lab from the point of view of, being ultra sort of creative on every building. I mean, there'll be room for iconic buildings and the like. But more from the point of view of our monitoring, measuring and sort of control strategies underneath. And can we actually, and this is part of that sort of standardisation effort of, can we actually find some sort of minimum sort of level of data capture and processes and procedures around that enable us to pretty much take code and control sequences and all the stuff that sort of enables buildings, take that and be able to redeploy it as much as possible. And so that redeployability is a really important thing to me, but it's underpinned by some sort of set minimum thresholds of monitoring and capability.
I'm hoping that the network of healthcare providers that we've developed through the Living Labs, that we can share with, or that they might be inspired to put their own data onto something like the DCH, and then lead to all public hospital data being on DCH, etc., because they can see the value add to that. So all of the examples that the different iHub projects have shown, and the relationships that we've developed through doing those projects, hopefully we can convince some of those existing clients and their networks about the value of putting more data, more monitoring in their sites and more data on platforms, because that enables them to measure any new technologies that they put in. If they replace their boilers with heat pumps, if they want to participate in demand response, if they want to put in different windows or something, that they have a means of measuring and quantifying the benefits for themselves, as well as all the other benefits of having reportable data.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? Oh, plenty. 3.
I just wanted to say, great exercise this afternoon, but I wanted an issue around the maintenance of all this stuff, the sustainability. I happen to live overseas for many years in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, where they spent bucket loads of money on the latest fandangle gas bid, put it up, you know, whether it was a building that was state of the art. And the great failure, all of them, when you walked in 10 years later, was that they weren't maintained over that period of time. All that data disappeared, the people weren't there to maintain it. To me, the sustainability is a bigger issue, the initiative of trying to get a net zero reduction. It's about how you do it long term.
So in the digital space, that's a really good question, and it's one that we wrestle with, and TK, I'm sure will talk to you extensively on that. You know, you sort of set up your systems, you know, a new tenant comes in, and all that sort of monitoring that you'd set up suddenly is inappropriate for the new tenant and the like. And so, you know, there's real issues around maintaining these sorts of systems. The IT industry seems to have been able to kind of set themselves onto standards and put in sort of continuous approaches and procedures for maintaining sort of migration. You know, as we go from iPhone 8 to iPhone 9 to whatever, you know, and that sort of migration, you know, there. So there is something that we can learn from the IT industry when it comes to the digital space. I've got something else, but I'll pass to you.
All of the technologies tested in the healthcare facilities were all common technologies that are in the market now. So because healthcare facilities are very risk averse, so they would only allow technologies that were at least a technology readiness level 7, and we had to also consider what were the impacts on the operation and maintenance and all of that sort of thing before we put anything in. So from the Living Labs perspective, we didn't install in any of the healthcare facilities anything that was way out there and completely new to the market. It might have been perhaps new to that sector, but we had to show them that there was enough knowledge in society to enable to support the particular technologies.
And the other thing about the sort of digital space there, and it came down to a discussion around, you know, do I maintain all my stuff on-prem or do I maintain it in the cloud? And there's an interesting discussion around that. You know, obviously you go into the cloud, you know, you start to think more about cybersecurity and stuff. But, you know, I've had a few people talk to me about, you know, when things are being maintained on-prem, you know, the password gets lost when the person who sort of created the system sort of departs the organisation and stuff. And the whole sort of maintenance of the infrastructure as a service kind of thing sort of can fall apart when it's kind of closely held sort of on site. And so there was some reason to sort of professionalise that sort of ongoing maintenance and version control and things like that.
I just wanted to also add to that, because I think it's a great question. As designers and constructors, you quite often think your job just finishes where it finishes. But you know, as well as maintenance, there's commissioning. You know, a large number of green buildings fall over because they're not commissioned properly. And then there's, you know, occupant education or building owner education as well. So there's a spectrum of stuff outside of our realm that we need to connect with and actually make sure they're in the tent.
Okay, I think this is another digital question. I'm wondering if we present buildings on a silver platter by having them digital ready, right? Have we done enough to excite the smartest minds in the room to go after buildings and unlock the potential for efficiency and decarbonization and attract them away from Facebook and other click-through optimization work that they could be doing? Is this the new gold rush that we hopefully unleash?
That's a great question. Of course, Google, Microsoft and others in the IT space are actually sort of investigating, trying to work through solutions here. So I don't think that it's an either-or sort of contest there. Do we pay enough for people with the skill sets required in our particular industry? I don't know. But it's a good question, and we'll wait and see.
Maybe just a follow-on, maybe it's a new type of architectural engineer, right? That one that combines both the physical system knowledge as well as the data science competency to actually become innovators and entrepreneurs in this market, right?
I was going to say that so many organisations now have net zero energy targets, and they have to report to their boards and or to their relative governments about their targets, and digital buildings are going to be a way that happens. So I think over the next 10 years, there will be a dramatic change in that, because they'll have to be able to certify their reductions.
So we will see self-driving buildings?
Is that okay? Then I think there was one, yes, over this side.
It's probably a technology question for the Living Lab team, or probably the people in the audience. You have spoken about I think, Dan, you presented about the readiness of air conditioning systems in terms of delivering DR services or flexible demand. I'm wondering, how is the air conditioning industry kind of responding to this new opportunity? Are they making their devices or hardware more amenable to participate in the market? Is the industry consciously even considering that or addressing that? Or we are kind of looking at adding additional quick fixes that would probably help us communicate with those hardware systems to deliver DR through HVAC. So yeah, how's the HVAC industry actually responding to this opportunity?
So part of the global cooling prize was part of the thing that a lot of industries have been working on more efficient aircons. For the residential living lab that's about to start in Queensland as part of Race 2030, Dakin is the air conditioner supplier, and they will be producing API controls for the aircon units, and they're the first, I think, company in Australia to do so. And split system aircons are really common in aged care centres, not just in general residential stuff, so it could be a good game changer. So Dakin is certainly leading in that sense. I must say though that in my perspective, sometimes I think that perhaps the air conditioning industry pays too close attention to the thermal comfort settings that ASHRAE says, and that's I'll be a bit controversial and say that not everybody is happy between 22 and 23 degrees, and we perhaps need to question the tight aircon settings that many buildings are based on. And I think in the future, part of the solution will be a better understanding of adaptive comfort, who can adapt, how can they adapt, and that includes how can the HVAC industry adapt to how they specify how aircon systems will run.
Certainly think with, just to follow on from that with more granular controls, IoT sensors and the like, it should be possible to actually improve comfort by taking closer attention to it than perhaps random sensors in random places in buildings. But going back to your question there, Energy Queensland have got 150 megawatts of flexible demand on their books through air conditioning. Essentially using predominantly demand response enabled devices. That was, I think, Georgios, you brought that up. It's a clunky one-way communications approach to it, so it's a bit sort of sledgehammer using existing comms capability that they've got. And I think with the products coming out, IT enabled and stuff, we should be able to do so much better than those demand response enabled devices. But it does require sort of this is the answer, you know, to get that sort of scalability. You know, 150 megawatts, that's a hell of a lot of air conditioners that are all sort of plugged into exactly the same kind of a device, standardised device, and, you know, sort of in a more cookie-cutter kind of way. And I think, you know, that's come up a couple of times in the discussions, that need to get that more plug-and-play sort of approach to it.
Thanks for that. Now, going to, in the sake of time, I've got a couple of questions. I just want to tidy it up. I'll give you a moment to think about the first question for all of you. The first one is, if you had your time again, and you've worked very hard, I know, over the last 3+ years, it hasn't just been, on paper it looks like 3 years, it's beyond that. If you had your time again, what's the one thing you do or not do to make your path easier? So is there something you would do? One thing, Wendy, not... So what's the one thing you would do that you've either learnt from that or you wouldn't do? So what's that one lesson to make this, would have made it whole easier?
I have one, which was, yeah, our hand was forced, but the IDSs that had face-to-face contact and the IDSs where we did a site visit to the actual facilities, by far and away above in terms of understanding and outcomes. So actually getting designers into an ambulance station or a school or whatever it is just makes a huge difference.
Of course, COVID didn't help with that.
Yeah, I think in our case we found out that it can take very long time to procure installations when it comes to government organizations. So we probably would have started that process a lot earlier, and because I think the approved contractors, I don't know if there is anyone in the room, but the approved contractors, when it comes to asking them to install something and they see you're in a hurry, you know, the price is much higher than what you would expect. So we could have started that process a lot earlier to allow for, I don't know, bidding and go to market and get prices that can fit the timeline of IHAB. Right now, yeah, some of the things we wanted to be doing with CO2 heat pumps, for example, didn't happen.
Thanks for that. Wendy or Steve?
I'll be a bit facetious and say I wish I was part of the legal teams that had to look at all the contracts.
If that was the one thing, if you had asked me this question, and I think Vincent would go, don't get lawyers involved too much. I said, not at all, but too much. Don't ask for a second opinion because you get 5 more, put it that way. And Stephen?
Oh, I don't know. I'd be a little bit facetious as well. So I was sort of hanging over the top, and at that strategic level, you know, things went pretty much to plan in terms of those 3 phases. One was the sort of developing the platform or selecting the platform, going through into the bring on the projects and now deploy. And to a certain extent, we'd love to have had more time. That's one part of it. And so at that strategic level, it was pretty much to plan. At individual project level, of course, you know, each project has got its own little story. And as Georgios was saying, sort of supply chains are an issue, sort of acquiring batteries. Who would have thought prior to COVID that it would take as long to buy a battery as it has? So my facetious response, I guess, is I would tell COVID to go away.
Of course, a number of times with all of you, there were some great ideas out there, and there was a whole lot of people who had great enthusiasm. Perhaps the one thing, don't take that initial enthusiasm as it's going to get done. That's something I saw, that it's those that stuck with it were the better ones. Then the last question for each of you before we wrap up. You've done some great work. You've all done great work. What's the one thing you would like to tell a loved one or somebody important, someone you respect, that you've done that wasn't there 3 years ago, that you've done, clearly your group of people have done? What's the thing that's changed the world or is just special?
The thing I'm probably most proud of is the fact that these studios are going to be continuing on, because for me that's clients and consultants and, you know, the designers of tomorrow. It's just going to be rolling out and rolling out and rolling out. So it's you know, when you have a payback period of 7 years and it pays back every 7 years into infinity, you know, it's, you know, that's going to make a big change, I hope.
I think, you know, I'm proud of the work that the CSIRO team has done with the data clearinghouse. Took a IoT platform that was tested and working in other industries, brought it into our building services industry, and it's grown and it's raised all the sorts of questions that we'd want it to, and that's kind of helping to inform the industry, and you know, I'll feel the dream when these sorts of guidelines and standards are actually being implemented and utilised around Australia.
I think one of the key things we've contributed is the network of all the state health departments and private hospitals and aged care facilities talking together for the first time, and also linking the facilities managers and the sustainability managers of those facilities with the medical practitioners of those facilities. So our sort of knowledge sharing network is now also linked with the general healthcare for in the future climates, medicos who are also looking at changing hospitals from a medical profession and supply chain profession. So bringing all those parties together to say they're all aiming for the same end goal, let's work better together.
Yeah, there are many great outputs, and it's very difficult to just choose one, I think. Tony, I was involved in the IDS. It's great work there. I think great idea, and it really changed the way we talk to the various disciplines in our classes. But for the living labs, I would say that one of the projects that was bringing together data from different states, it was a long process. You know, we put freedom of information requests and stuff like that. Bringing all those data sets together and being able to now have a clear view of how to benchmark school buildings across Australia, across different states, that was a really good contribution in my view. But also the work that Michael and Dan presented earlier, where, you know, something I would think is impossible really to apply in practice, that demonstrate that demand response is possible to happen, and that a building owner will never, you know, go very near unless they know a lot about demand response, and they normally don't. So demonstrating that was a great achievement in my view. So well done to my colleagues, I think, for that.
Well, team, thank you for answering the questions. Can we put our hands together for the people who put this together? So just to wrap this up, a couple of things. One, it's not over yet, you know all that. We've got a number of deadlines for the final projects to let you know about this, just to let you know what the next phase of this project is from certainly our end. One, the final projects reports are being put forward to ARENA, and I also want to thank ARENA for the funding that's been part of this. They then sign that off. The final reports will then go up. It'll be after June, probably sometime in July. They'll go up on the iHub website. We're developing 3 short videos to promote the ideas that have been created, but they're not just there to be historical. The idea is to say, how can we take the next step? We've got all this stuff. What else is there? So that's the concept of that. There's a number of articles that are being written about the final phase of them. They'll appear in the Era magazine's Equilibrium, but as well as other places throughout the university sectors and all those sorts of things. I also do want to leave the impression it wasn't just this group of universities, Melbourne, QUT, University of Wollongong. There were other tertiary institutions involved, like Charles Darwin, Swinburne had a role in there. there was others in there. So this just hasn't been kept to a group of 3 or 4. That's what I want to say, that this information has already been distributed and communicated to a number of other tertiary sectors, and the TAFE sectors as well have been involved. So we've really tried to spread the word. The other aspect of the last one is that this will also be showcased at the ARBS exhibition through what AIRA's doing, and there are some speakers or case studies of that exhibition, so stay tuned for that as well. So I want to firstly to thank everyone attending today, both here and online. I also want to ask Marie, give us a wave down the back. Stand up, Marie, for organising this. So appreciate you doing all of that. Appreciate you all coming here today. These events are always good if you network, and I know a lot of people talking. There are some refreshments that are available at the end in about 3 or 4 minutes at 5 o'clock, just to the left down the corridor here. Anyone who has had a pink donut, I hope they're all right. I hope they haven't collapsed. Please, thanks for today. It's been great. Really appreciate everyone's effort. It really shows the investment of what people have done, what the investment arena's put in, and the time and effort of so many in. So appreciate you coming here today. And go safely. Please join us for some networking.